We now move on to the next business, which is the motion on wild animals in circuses. I have to announce that the Speaker has not selected the amendment, and I therefore call on Mr Mark Pritchard to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to put on record my thanks to all the members of the Backbench Business Committee for the opportunity to raise this important issue. I'd also like to thank the clerks for all their helpful advice and assistance in preparation for today's debate. This has been an interesting few days, Mr Deputy Speaker. It remains a mystery why the government has mounted such a concerted operation to stop there being a vote on this motion, or indeed any amendment that would allow a ban on wild animals in circuses. I was flexible on amendments. I'm only going to take two interventions. All right, so I will.
I'm very grateful to him. Can he confirm that he and the Conservative colleagues who are in favour of helping the lions and the tigers have actually not just been put under pressure by the Lance Corporals of the Whip's office, but directly from the heart of government, from number 10? What is it with our Prime Minister that he's got no affection for these lions and tigers waiting to be released from caged imprisonment?
Well, all I can say is 64% of members of this House support a ban on wild animals in circuses. I can't speak for the Prime Minister, he can speak for himself. So it's been an interesting week, and this is a government that has said from the outset that it wanted to reassert the authority of Parliament. This is a government that has said that it wants to listen to people. 92% of the British public want to see a ban on wild animals in circuses. Over 200 members of this House have signed an early day motion wanting to see a ban. And as I said, a YouGov poll for Dodds, 64% of members of this House want to see a ban. So why isn't the government listening to the will of this House and, more importantly, the will of the people?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, but on his point about the government wanting to reassert the importance of this House, can he therefore explain why the government still appears to be claiming that Europe could somehow intervene and prevent us from doing this? And will he confirm that the relevant commissioner said only a few days ago that responsibility for the welfare of circus animals remained in this country and with this House?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an accurate and pertinent point, and if I may, I'd like to address those particular points later on in my remarks. But I do want to focus on the interesting last few days. It was a week where on Monday, if I offered to amend my motion or drop my motion or not call a vote on this motion, and we're not talking about a major defence issue or an economic issue or an issue of public sector reform, we're talking about the ban of wild animals in circuses. So on Monday, I was offered reward and incentive. If I amended my motion, if I didn't call for a ban, I was offered a job. Now, not as a minister, so don't panic, those are competing. It was a pretty trivial job, as most of the ones I have up until at least probably 30 minutes from now are. But I was offered incentive and reward on Monday. Then it was ratcheted up till last night, where I was threatened. I had a call from the Prime Minister's office directly. And I was told, unless I withdraw this motion, that the Prime Minister himself said that he would look upon it very dimly indeed. Well, I have a message for the Whips and for the Prime Minister of our country, and I didn't pick a fight with the Prime Minister of our country, but I have a message. I may just be a little council house lad from a very poor background, but that background gives me a backbone, it gives me a thick skin, and I'm not going to be kowtowed by the Whips or even the Prime Minister of my country on an issue that I feel passionately about, that I have conviction about. There may be some people with other backgrounds in this place on our side, and they will speak later, and on the other side. But we need a generation of politicians with a bit of spine, not jelly. And I will not be bullied by any of the whips. This is an issue that I have campaigned on for many years. In the last Parliament, I had an adjournment debate. In the last Parliament, I spoke on the Animal Welfare Bill, the passage of the bill, and I've consistently campaigned on this issue, and I will not kowtow to that sort of unnecessary, disproportionate pressure. I will not, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I can't give way because I have very, very limited time. I can only give way to. I have very limited time. I'm grateful. I'm sure it would have been a wonderful intervention, as they usually are, from my right honourable friend. But the fact is that we are in a place, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I hoped we could have avoided. I tried to cooperate, even in the lobby last night. I spoke to the whips, and I said, perhaps we can amend the motion.
Angie Bray.
I wonder, are we actually going to get on to the substance of the debate at any stage, rather than debating my right from a friend?
Order. I know Mr. Pritchard is now going to move on to the substance of the motion before the House. Point of order, Mr. McShane.
Anything more important than a member of this House being allowed to speak as he wishes and not being threatened and intimidated? This goes to the heart of what we should be debating.
We're here today to debate the motion before the House, and that's exactly what we're now going to proceed to do. Mr. Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Today, this country has 3 travelling circuses, 39 wild animals in total: zebras, tigers, lions, camels, and up until recently, until the exposure of the brutality of Annie the elephants. So there are no elephants currently within circuses in England. And let's remember that this measure applies to England only. And I pay credit to the SNP for moving possibly a ban in Scotland. But the trouble with the government's proposed licensing scheme, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that it would create a new generation of animals that could be imported. It would basically give a green light to new imports. So we may not have any elephants left in circuses now, but would certainly have some if this licensing regime comes into effect. And my concern, as is the concern of 92% of the public, and there are very few public policy areas of that sort of support, is about the housing and transportation and cruel and cramped conditions within that housing and transportation. And that is why countries like Singapore, Bolivia, Israel, places like Hungary have banned the use of wild animals in circuses. And many of those circuses are commercially successful. I'd like to pay tribute also to the media, especially the Independent and the Sunday Express, who have for many years campaigned in the same way. But I want to address the specifics of the government's proposal for licensing. It is well-intentioned, but it will not improve animal welfare. I think it will be difficult to both monitor, implement, and enforce. The licensing regime will also be very costly, and it could cost taxpayers over £1 million. And an unintended consequence may be to, as I mentioned earlier, to inadvertently legitimise the import of new animals and continue the use, and I believe the exploitation, of wild animals in circuses. And our colleagues today really prepared to vote for that. Some of my colleagues have approached me legitimately and said, you know, I don't really believe in banning things, but I, whilst taking a similar approach, like to look at each case on its merits and take each issue on a case-by-case basis. And if we follow the logic that people don't like to ban anything, then we wouldn't have banned bear baiting in this house some time ago, or badger baiting, or dog fighting, or perhaps something else like carrying knives in a public place, or even slavery. And there have been some myths put about prior to this debate, that today's motion would see the end of zoos. That is not right. The motion would not affect zoos. That this motion would put an end to falconry. That is not right. It would not affect falconry. It only relates to wild animals, some of those I've listed today, and the definition of wild animal being a species that doesn't originate in the British Islands. There's also been some concern at the Department of Culture, Media and Sports about the impact and effect on the entertainment industry. I can reassure the House that the motion today would not have an impact on the entertainment, film and television industry, as set out in DEFRA's own regulatory impact assessment paragraphs 34 and 37, that travelling circus animals are entirely different to those animals kept in static locations and kept by private keepers. Although I hope that with the advancement of digital technology, eventually there will be an end to the use of wild animals in films and TV, because many of those animals are warehoused when they're not being used, warehoused like a carton of vegetables. But I'd like to concentrate on the legal issues primarily today. And notwithstanding the government's written ministerial statement on the 13th of May, and the subsequent revised government response on the 19th of May through an urgent question, I hope the government will now accept that there are no legitimate outstanding legal impediments to prevent a ban in England. I'm not going to give way, forgive me, I know the Honourable Lady has a long track record on this issue, but I'm pressed for time. The fact is that if the amendment had been selected this morning by Mr. Speaker, and it's relevant to this particular point, it would have been kicking this motion into the long grass. There would have been no ban on the use of wild animals because we would have had to, as a country, wait for other legal cases in other parts of Europe. And that in itself is a red herring. In his statement to the House last month, the Minister told Parliament that a court case against the Austrian government would commence shortly, column 497, given that the Austrian government wanted to introduce a ban. I understand that the papers have now finally been submitted to the court in Vienna, but there is no live case. Interestingly, despite outright bans in other EU countries, and I've listed some, Greece and Luxembourg to add a few others, a legal case has never been brought or won before. It is not uncommon in this House to hear of governments sheltering behind courts in Brussels or Strasbourg, but to hear from my own very front bench that this government is now sheltering behind a domestic court in Vienna is completely a new innovation. And there are two further flaws in the government's so-called legal defence. Is the government of this country now suggesting that the threat of legal action or the possible outcome of court cases is enough to paralyse government decision-making? Fear is not usually the prerequisite to success. What is even more, the government, if it was correct, is now seeking that Vienna is put before the courts in London. And if the government waited for a court case in Vienna, and their papers have been submitted, if the court case went through and the European Circus Association lost, there would then be an automatic appeal to a European court. That would add further delay, further procrastination, and further get the government off the hook of introducing a ban in this country. And even if that case then was spent, there could be another European court considering another case in another European capital. Notwithstanding my comments, the reality is that the government's Austrian defence is a red herring, given the European Commission has clearly stated that a ban is a matter for member states alone. An issue where English courts decide. Surely that is something to celebrate in this age of judicial creep from Europe, but also something to exercise and implement. Therefore, a ban can be introduced in an English court without waiting for other European capitals to decide, and without interference from Europe, and that makes a refreshing change. The government has also invoked the Human Rights Act. Yes, that old chestnut. The sooner the government scraps the Act and introduces a British Bill of Rights, the better for everyone. But let's test the Act in an English court, a domestic court, where even Brussels wants such cases heard. Let the government have the courage of its own convictions. And DEFRA's own legal advice suggests a ban would perhaps breach circus owners' property rights under the Human Rights Act. Well, let's test it in the courts. Let's see what the courts have to say in London, in England, not in Vienna or Austria or in Brussels or in Strasbourg or in Copenhagen or some other European capital. And I'd like to pay tribute to the Minister today. He's been put in a very, very difficult position. On the 19th of May, he told this House courageously and bravely that he would like personally to see a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. We know that DEFRA officials want to see a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. We are told through reports that the Secretary of State herself is minded for a ban, and yet Number 10 has overruled. So much for devolution, so much for allowing departments to get on with themselves, getting on with their own business, and so much to the ending of the control freakery of Number 10, both in the last government. It seems to have slipped into this government. The government has also suggested and invoked the European Services Directive, saying that on the 19th that a ban would breach this directive, that a ban would fail to meet the proportionality legal test. But I can tell you that that is not the case, and the European Commission have denied that is the case. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I appeal to the House to support my motion. Let us get Britain back to where it was in the last century, leading the world on animal welfare issues rather than lagging behind the world. And let's put an end to the use of wild animals in circuses.
The question is, as on the order paper, there is a 6-minute limit on backbench contributions, and as you can see, this is a very popular debate. Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very pleased indeed to follow the Honourable Gentleman for the weekend, and I congratulate him. I can't imagine that he's in the running for Backbencher of the Month with his Chief Whip, and maybe he might have to wait a wee while, given his report, for more invites to receptions at Number 10. But he's shown great tenacity and determination to keep this issue alive in Parliament and to bring it to the attention of the House today with the able assistance of the Honourable Gentleman from Colchester. I want to express my thanks to the Backbench Committee, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing time for this debate. This may not be viewed by some as being of significant political consequence, Mr. Deputy Speaker. However, it means a great deal to many people, as evidenced by the thousands of respondents to the DEFRA consultation last year, by the numbers signing the independent newspapers petition, by the hundreds of MPs who have signed the relevant EDMs, and by the emails and letters MPs have been receiving, not just in the last few days, but indeed over the past 14 months. I should declare an interest in this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I was the DEFRA Minister who left this to the Honourable Gentleman from South East Cambridgeshire to sort out. And I apologise to him for that. I'm sure he'd rather be concentrating on other matters, but I know he is a politician of integrity and is highly regarded, and I know he will take notice of the debate and the vote today. Of course I give way to the
Honourable Gentleman, give way. As he had ministerial responsibility for this, I have just one question which I'm really genuinely seeking after knowledge. In the last Parliament, we spent a lot of time going through the Animal Welfare Act and getting it passed into legislation, and we were told it was the most up-to-date legislation practically in the world. Why, if there's a concern here about animal welfare, why isn't it covered by the provisions of the Animal Welfare Act?
Well, it's a very good question, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I will come on to the 2006 Act in due course. The 2006 Act, as I understand it, could be the enabling legislation to introduce the ban. So in that instance, and I will mention the 2000 Act shortly in my contribution, I think that may clarify it for the Honourable Gentleman. Mr. Deputy Speaker, will the Honourable Gentleman allow me to give way, because obviously I'm very limited with 6 minutes, and if I can, I will give way later on in my speech. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I took over as Minister of State in 2009, the question of wild animals and circuses had been left over from the 2006 Animal Welfare Act. That Act was much needed and warmly welcomed and took animal welfare to a much better place. But wild animals and circuses were not specifically covered. I was lobbied by the Bond Free Foundation, as well as the RSPCA and Animal Defenders International, as well as by numerous parliamentary colleagues. DEFRA organised a consultation. We all know the outcome. 94.5% of the 13,000 respondents said, we want a ban. My honourable friend for Leeds Central, the then Secretary of State, agreed that we should express our conclusions before last May's election, and we said we were minded to introduce a ban. Recently there's been much comment about legal impediments. Research has shown that the European Circus Owners Association, as the honourable gentleman for the weekend alluded to, challenged the ban in Austria in 2006 at the European Commission, and they lost. They invoked the European Ombudsman, and they lost. The Ombudsman asked the Commission to evaluate whether the Austrian ban on wild animals in circuses was proportionate. The Commission's final opinion in September 2009, as laid out in the library documents available in the pack for today's debate, sets out why it did not believe that there were grounds for an accusation of maladministration, and also set out its view on the proportionality of the Austrian ban. They ruled that this is a matter for member states to decide. There was much advice offered to me as a minister, Mr Deputy Speaker. My recollection that the legal questions were over whether a ban would require primary or secondary legislation. I don't remember a European dimension to the advice, but of course memory does play tricks on us, and I won't give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and in his time as a minister he was a good minister. Does he regret that he didn't introduce a ban in his time as a minister?
I regret that we didn't, as a Labour government, introduce a ban. However, the Animal Welfare Act was a major piece of legislation, and we did try our best, but given the constraints, the time frame that we had between when I was appointed as Minister of State and the May election in 2010 wasn't long enough to be able to introduce that ban. But we gave a commitment to the animal welfare lobby, to parliamentary colleagues and to the public that if we were re-elected, which sadly we weren't of course, we were minded to introduce a ban, and I'm convinced we would have gone ahead and done that. The biggest obstacle to progress, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I can remember, as mentioned by the honourable gentleman from the Wrekin, were from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. DCMS contended that any such ban could harm our creative industries by outlawing the use of animals in film and TV productions at worst, or reducing the number of performing animals available at best. Either way, the contention was that the threat to film and TV productions would move abroad and would cost us jobs and revenue. We had numerous discussions about this, and eventually we were able to reassure DCMS that this would not be the case, and that we could ring-fence the ban, as described by the honourable gentleman who moved the motion for wild animals in circuses. They dropped their objection, and the government had a united policy which appeared in our manifesto in May last year. There are all kinds of questions raised about whether wild animals should be performing and which ones ought to be allowed. My main concern was and is about the conditions in which they are kept at venues and on the road. We are all mostly reassured that modern zoos create environments for the animals to try to reflect their origins, their natural habitats and behaviour patterns. The question has to be asked, Mr Deputy Speaker, how can that be done in the back of a cage attached to a lorry driving through the motorways of Britain? Even this morning on BBC Breakfast, the camera crew visiting a circus were not allowed to film the animals' living quarters. I think that speaks volumes. Why the reluctance, Mr Deputy Speaker? I think we all know. The government says they want to introduce a licensing system rather than a ban. The system would say any circuses that wish to have wild animals such as tigers, lions and elephants performing in them will need to demonstrate that they meet high animal welfare standards for each animal before they can be granted a licence to keep those animals. Areas being considered as part of the licensing conditions include the rules for transport of the animal, the type of quarters including winter quarters, and the treatment by trainers and keepers. Mr Deputy Speaker, I know from my time at DEFRA that DEFRA want to improve the welfare of animals across the piece and to improve the situation as it exists at the moment. And it's even been suggested by some that this licensing regime could introduce a ban through the back door. I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, we don't want a ban through the back door, we want a ban through the front door. We want honesty and transparency in the laws and regulations we debate and introduce, and we want clarity and not confusions. The public, Mr Deputy Speaker, by the voice that they have articulated, have said that they want a ban. Members in every party have said that they want a ban. I hope and appeal to honourable members on all sides of the House, when it comes to voting tonight at 6 o'clock, to support the motion standing in the name of the honourable gentleman from Wrekin, Colchester and myself.
Andrew Rosendale.
Mr Deputy Speaker, animal welfare matters to British people across this country, but we in this House have a duty and a responsibility to make decisions based on facts, knowledge and the science of any issue relating to animal welfare. If we make decisions based purely on opinion polls and emotions, we are going to get ourselves into a great deal of difficulty. And I have to say to the honourable member for the Wrekin, I didn't hear anything in his speech about the actual welfare of the animals. This is something, in a moment I'll give way. This is something that we have to make a decision on based on cool, hard facts and knowledge of the situation. And the speeches I've heard today do not do that. They are avoiding the real issues about animal welfare, and they are pandering to the emotions of animal rights activists who care more about their political agenda than they do about the real welfare of animals. Mr Deputy Speaker, I condemn utterly and totally cruelty to animals of any kind. I was the Shadow Minister for Animal Welfare for 3 years before the last election, and I had the same instinct as many people in this chamber do today, as many people in the opinion polls do, when they say that isn't it dreadful, it should be banned, how awful this is. But could I please make some progress, and I'll give way. But I instead of basing my views purely on what the newspapers say or what opinion polls say, I looked into it. The truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in this country we have a very small number of animals that are in the circus, 39 animals in total. They are not captured from the jungle and dragged into the circus. Many of them are born and bred generations into the circus. Their entire rhythm of life is based, not at the moment. Their entire rhythm of life is based around what they have been with since they were born. Now, yes, on the face of it, people think, Mr Deputy Speaker, may I continue, please? On the face of it, I agree it looks to a lot of people that this is all very, very cruel. The reality is that many of these animals have been so domesticated over so many years that to wrench them out of the life that they are used to would I believe be more cruel than to allow them to continue. The welfare is what the government has to implement. We have an Animal Welfare Act. If there are cruelty to animals, we can use existing legislation, or as the government is proposing, licensing, to deal with real cruelty. What is amazing to me is that we are focusing on an area where there is almost no cruelty. But there isn't. But you see, I'm afraid once again, no one wants to hear the facts. They don't. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am fed up with animals being used as a political football. If you want to campaign for animal welfare, look at the facts of a situation, examine the reality. Don't use it as a way of promoting a political agenda. And I'm afraid to say that certain animal welfare organisations...
Andrew. Sit down. Mr Rosendale is not giving way, and so persistent requests are really not helping the situation. I'm sure he will let the House know when he's ready to take an intervention. Mr. Rossiter.
Being shouted down, which I don't think is very fair, especially for a Green Member of Parliament. I thought you wanted to hear the other point of view. I am a champion for animal welfare, but I'm not going to. But you see what I mean? But I'm not going to just follow the crowd. I'm going to look at the facts of this, and what you are proposing is actually worse than what these poor animals are used to. They live in an environment that they have been brought up in and used to over their entire life. If you wrench those animals away from the people that they have lived with and have looked after them and loved them and cared for them, and if their rhythm of life is obliterated, you are being more cruel than actually allowing them to continue. I'll give way now.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. The Honourable Member says he wants science. What about the science from the British Veterinary Association, which says, and I quote, "The welfare needs of non-domesticated wild animals cannot be met within the environment of a travelling circus. A licensing scheme will not address these issues." The BVA is one of the most respected scientific organisations for animal welfare in this country. What does the Honourable Member say to that?
Non-domesticated. Now, these are wild animals, but when you have lions and tigers that are 10th generation born in that environment, you're no longer talking about a lion that has been taken out of its natural environment, dragged into the circus. And I'm afraid to say that this is so often being used by organisations for fundraising. Charities raise money, animal rights groups raise money, and this issue is raised as a way of attracting political support and donations by whipping up emotions. No, I will not give way. By whipping up emotions instead of treating the facts as they are. We have an Animal Welfare Act, a brilliant piece of legislation from the last government that we supported. That can be used when cruelty occurs. But I appeal to this House, don't go with the crowd, look at the facts, don't wrench these creatures away from the life that they are used to and have grown up in. If you do that, you are going to be more cruel than actually leaving them where they are with the people and the environment that they are used to. I'll give way.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman giving way, and I wonder if he could just share with the House his views as to whether third-generation slaves in the United States, born into slavery, were content with slavery more so than those who were enslaved in the first place.
Well, I'm afraid I have to say I'm sorry that the debate is being dragged to such a level. Instead of dealing with the facts, you are ultimately saying that animals.
Order once again. I can see that emotions are running high, but I just remind the House, when you say you mean me. So please, Mr. Rosender.
I knew that my views would be unpopular, but please, I ask honourable members to perhaps take something away from what I'm saying, because I believe in animal welfare passionately, and I looked at this for 3 years. I visited circuses, I spoke to people who deal with training the animals, and I know that the animals are loved and cared for, and this is like a pack hunting a tiny little bit of tradition which still exists in this country, where the animal welfare standards are greatly considered and put in a way that ensures that the animals are loved and cared for. I'm afraid to say that if we rush to make a decision based pure emotion and based on opinion polls, I really think it's an irresponsible decision. We should look at the facts, we should understand the long-term interests of animal welfare and use existing legislation to deal with this issue.
Jim Dowd.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think that contribution can best be described as idiosyncratic or idiotic, depending upon your point of view. I mean, to say that this issue is not about the welfare of animals is either to display a stupidity which is quite mind-numbing, or else it's a deliberate attempt not to face up to the heart of this issue. And as the honourable gentleman from the Wrekin, I'm just about to mention, said in his introductory remarks to this debate, this is entirely about animal welfare. It's only about, 40 or so animals, there's various numbers, where it's 36 or 37. It doesn't matter about the numbers. What matters is cruelty. I give way to the gentleman.
Giving way in the absence of not having been being able to intervene on my honourable friend for Romford. I think he needs to be careful not to be too harsh on my honourable friend, because the honourable member for Romford did actually write the forward in 2009 for the Great British Circus and previous forwards as well. Perhaps that's why he wouldn't allow me to intervene.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for that that intervention. I suspect the honourable member for the Wrekin may be onto something there. But what I'm also puzzled by is this is a relatively minor issue, as I say, somewhere between 36 and 40 animals involved. The other thing that was said, the honourable lady from the speaks for the Green Party, when she was quoting the British Veterinary Association, they also said captive animals, and the honourable member for Romford, didn't grasp the difference between domesticated and captive animals. You can have captive animals which are still wild, which are certainly nowhere near domesticated, even unto the nth generation. They remain wild, their instincts are those of wild creatures, and what the British Veterinary Association said was, in captivity in circuses there are no circumstances under which they can demonstrate their natural behaviour. And that will remain the case regardless of a regulatory scheme. And the big disadvantage with the regulatory scheme, if there were such a thing, is A, it's a more complicated way of dealing with the matter. And B, it's much more likely to increase, not reduce, the number of wild animals being used in circuses. I'm delighted.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I've received a huge number of emails and correspondence from constituents about this issue. The honourable member for Wrekin, who I congratulate for bringing the debate, mentioned how the conditions in which they are kept is adverse to the animal, but also in terms of the comments that member for Romford was mentioning, in terms of facts, the usual life expectancy of animals kept in these conditions falls way short compared to others which aren't.
That is indeed true. I think where the honourable member for Romford was being most disingenuous or misinformed, depending how you want to look at it, was in saying there is not a body of evidence based on animal welfare considerations that supports the ban. It is entirely predicated on that. He may not have understood the evidence, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And, just this once then. Go on.
As a scientist, I'm very interested in evidence. Could he spot what the facts were that we were being asked to listen to by the honourable member for Romford? Because I missed all of those, whereas there seem to be facts that were raised by the honourable lady for Brighton Pavilion, which are much more interesting.
I think the honourable gentleman has it exactly right there. I mean, you can. I think you have to listen. I think the honourable member for Romford's speech would bear rereading, as they say, and perhaps we can have a prize for anybody who can mine a single fact out of it. But don't send it to me. Whatever you do, don't send it to me. The other point that the honourable member for the Wrekin made, and I remember we were certainly he and my honourable friend for Poplar and Limehouse. And myself and Brian Blessed, amongst others, were over at Downing Street just a few, I think towards the end of March, precisely to hand in a letter calling for the ban, for this particular ban to be introduced. I know that there are those on those benches who are ideologically opposed to bans of any kind, which is a strange position, but it's understandable, because of course this House, this legislature, this Parliament, is precisely about, the whole body of law is about bans of one kind or another and different ways to change people's behaviour, and to say if you behave in a certain way there will be certain consequences. Of course, no law can ever make people better and make people right, but what you can say is there are patterns of behaviour and conduct which are acceptable and there are those which are not. And cruelty to animals, hang on for a moment, this is coming out of my time, cruelty to animals is one of those considerations. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Isn't it a fact that zoos have spent a lot of money doing the research to find out what sorts of facilities should be made available for such animals that we're discussing today? And it's quite clear that travelling circuses can't provide those same facilities.
strongly with my honourable friend. It's also the matter that zoos, actually, if you speak to those involved with the zoo and aquaria, are looking very carefully now at the kinds of animals that they will actually exhibit and those that they will not. And large mammals and large carnivores are very much at the top of their considerations. The issue of animal welfare, I'm sure just about every member in this House will know, is one of the most persistent issues raised with us by our constituents over time. It is, in the 19 years that I've been in this House, I've got a database running into many thousands of people who have raised various issues with me. People feel very strongly about these issues, and quite rightly. I believe it is the hallmark of a civilised nation that you have the highest possible animal welfare standards, and I still do believe this to be a civilised nation. I'm not a religious person myself, but there is a maxim which says that the hottest corner of hell is reserved for those who are cruel to children and animals. And all I can say is, in that regard, as a lifelong atheist, I hope there is a hell, precisely for that reason. People raise issues with us because they do care, and they do understand. For the honourable member for Romford, I don't want to concentrate on it, but it really was quite a extraordinary, my honourable friend says, extraordinary contribution to essentially describe the entire pantheon of animal welfare organisations, many of whom have royal charters, many of whom have been around for centuries, for decades, as some kind of trendy conspiracy invented, simply to please Guardian readers, is ludicrous. Ludicrous. The minister, I accept, is in a very difficult position. I think he's made his position personally clear on this. What I cannot understand, and as I say, the member for Wrekin alluded to this, is why such a relatively straightforward and simple issue has been handled by the government in this fashion. The idea of number 10 getting personally involved in an issue like this shows a curious lack of proportion. It also stands curiously when tested against the idea that they're now listening, and listening is a sign of strength. I've got 30 seconds left, so if you can be as quick as you can.
Intervention. I'm very pleased to announce that the Conservative government, coalition government hopefully, but certainly on the Conservative side, have seen the sense, heard the voice of the British people, and have now allowed a free vote.
Well, we should, to paraphrase George Orwell, there are free votes and there are free votes. Some votes are more free. Some votes are more free than others. There's a great deal more to be said on this issue. Unfortunately, not by me, but I urge members to support the motion.
Matthew Offord.
Speaker, I'm very pleased to be called in this debate, but I do find it rather sad that we're still talking about this issue after so much time, particularly back in 2009 when DEFRA officials said that under the Animal Welfare Act, the